The Wyoming wind howled like a wounded animal across the vast plains, carried with it the scent of impending rain and the weight of Thomas McKenna's grief. At 52, his weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of his pickup truck as he squinted through the gathering darkness. The storm had come out of nowhere, as they often did in this unforgiving corner of the American West. Thomas had been returning from town after selling what little cattle he could afford to part with. The ranch that had been his family for 3 generations was slowly dying, much like everything else in his life since Sarah's passing 2 years ago. The cancer had taken her quickly, leaving him alone in a house that felt too big and too quiet. The first fat raindrop splattered against his windshield just as lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, ghostly white. Thunder followed seconds later, a deep rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Thomas knew these storms well. They could turn deadly in minutes, spawning tornadoes or flash floods that could sweep away everything in their path. His headlights cut through the increasing darkness, revealing a familiar outline of Pine Ridge, a small cluster of abandoned mining cabins from the 1880s. Most folks avoided the area, considering it cursed after a mine collapse had killed dozens of workers. But Thomas had always found a strange comfort in the ghost town solitude. The rain began in earnest now, sheets of water that turned the dirt road into a treacherous river of mud. Thomas felt his truck beginning to slide, the rear wheels losing their grip on the slick surface. He pumped the brakes gently, but it was too late. The truck skidded off the road and came to rest against a boulder, the engine sputtering to a stop. "Damn it all," Thomas muttered, his breath visible in the sudden chill. He tried the ignition several times, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The storm was intensifying, and he knew he couldn't stay in the truck. Hypothermia was a real threat, especially with his clothes already damp from the humidity. Grabbing his jacket and a flashlight from the glove compartment, Thomas stepped out into the storm. The wind immediately tried to knock him off his feet, and the rain stung his face like needles. He pulled his hat down low and made his way toward the nearest cabin, a small structure that had somehow managed to survive over a century of harsh Wyoming winters. The cabin's door was locked, but Thomas had learned long ago that sometimes a man had to bend the rules to survive. He found a loose board near the back and pried it away, creating an opening just large enough to squeeze through. The interior was musty and cold, but it was dry, and that was all that mattered. Thomas swept his flashlight around the single room, taking inventory. There was an old wood stove, a few pieces of furniture covered in dust, and something else, a sound that didn't belong in an abandoned cabin during a storm. It was faint at first, almost lost in the howling wind outside. But as Thomas stood perfectly still, listening with the practiced ear of a man who had spent his life in the wilderness, he heard it clearly. A baby was crying. The sound sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Thomas moved slowly toward the source of the crying, his flashlight beam dancing across the rough wooden walls. In the far corner, partially hidden behind an overturned table, he found a small bundle wrapped in blankets. His hands trembled as he knelt down and carefully moved the blankets aside. There, red-faced and cried with a desperate intensity that only a hungry, frightened baby could muster, was an infant that couldn't have been more than a few months old. "Jesus Christ," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. He looked around the cabin frantically, searching for any sign of the baby's parents or guardian. But the cabin was empty except for the two of them. The baby's cries grew more intense, and Thomas felt a familiar panic rising in his chest. He and Sarah had tried for years to have children, but it had never happened. He knew nothing about babies, nothing about what they needed or how to care for them. But as he looked down at the tiny, helpless face, something stirred in his chest that he hadn't felt in 2 years. It wasn't quite hope, but it wasn't despair either. It was something else entirely, a sense of purpose, perhaps, or simply the basic human instinct to protect something vulnerable. Thomas gently lifted the baby, surprised by how light and fragile the little one felt in his arms. The crying subsided slightly, as if the child sensed that help had arrived. In his flashlight beam, Thomas could see that it was a girl, with wispy dark hair and the most beautiful brown eyes he had ever seen. "Where'd you come from, little one?" he asked softly, his voice barely a whisper. "And where is your mama?" The storm raged through the night, but Thomas barely noticed. He had managed to get the old wood stove working, filling the cabin with blessed warmth. The baby, he had started thinking of her as Emma, though he didn't know why, had fallen asleep in his arms after he had fashioned a makeshift bottle from a water bottle and a piece of cloth. He had found a small container of formula in the blankets with a baby, along with a few diapers and a note written in shaky handwriting. Her name is Emma Rose. Please take care of her. I can't do this anymore. She deserves better than what I can give her. Thomas had read the note a dozen times, trying to understand what could drive a parent to abandon their child in such a remote location. He thought about his own parents, who had worked themselves to the bone to keep the ranch running and provide for their family. He thought about Sarah, who would have given anything to hold a baby in her arms. As dawn broke through the storm clouds, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Thomas made his way back to his truck with Emma bundled securely in his arms. The engine started on the first try, as if the mechanical troubles of the night before had been just another part of the storm's fury. The drive back to his ranch took twice as long as usual, with Thomas stopping every few miles to check on Emma and make sure she was comfortable. She slept most of the way, her tiny fist curled around his finger, and Thomas found himself talking to her in a voice he hadn't used since Sarah's death. "You see that mountain over there, Emma? That's where your new home is. It's not much to look at right now, but it's got good bones. My great-grandfather built the house with his own hands, and it's weathered every storm this country could throw at it." When they finally reached the ranch, Thomas sat in his truck for a long moment, staring at the house that had been his whole world for 52 years. It looked different somehow, less empty, less final. There was a future here again, even if he didn't know what it looked like. Mrs. Henderson, his nearest neighbor who lived 5 miles down the road, was waiting on his porch when he pulled up. She was a practical woman in her 70s who had helped care for Sarah during her final months, and she had an uncanny ability to show up whenever she was needed most. "Thomas McKenna, where have you been all night?" she called out as he stepped out of the truck. "I was worried sick when I saw that storm roll in, and you weren't. Oh, my Lord, is that a baby?" Thomas looked down at Emma, who was beginning to stir in his arms. "Her name is Emma," he said simply. "I found her in one of the old cabins up at Pine Ridge. She was abandoned." Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted from surprise to concern to something that looked like understanding. She had been present for many of the conversations between Thomas and Sarah about their inability to have children, and she had seen the way the loss had hollowed him out after Sarah's death. "Let's get her inside," she said, taking charge in a way that only a woman who had raised 6 children of her own could do. "She'll need proper feeding and a warm bath, and you'll need to call the authorities. Thomas, this isn't something you can just handle on your own." But as they walked toward the house, Emma opened her eyes and looked directly at Thomas. In that moment, something passed between them that transcended words or logic or legal obligations. She wasn't just a baby he had found in a storm. She was his responsibility now, his chance at redemption, his path back to the world of the living. "I know I need to call someone," Thomas said quietly, "but not yet. Let me take care of her first. Let me make sure she's safe and healthy. Then we'll figure out what comes next." Mrs. Henderson studied his face for a long moment, and Thomas could see the debate playing out in her eyes. She was a woman who believed in rules and proper procedures, but she was also a woman who understood the healing power of love and responsibility. "1 week," she said finally. "You have 1 week to get your head on straight and figure out how you're going to handle this. But if you're serious about this, Thomas, you're going to need help. You can't raise a baby alone, especially not while you're trying to save this ranch." Thomas nodded, knowing she was right. The ranch was barely breaking even, and he had been considering selling it to pay off his debts. But now, with Emma in his arms, the idea of leaving this place seemed impossible. This was where she belonged, where she could grow up with space to run and clean air to breathe and the kind of values that came from working the land. "I'll figure it out," he said, and for the first time in 2 years, he actually believed it. The week passed in a blur of sleepless nights, emergency trips to town for baby supplies, and crash courses in infant care courtesy of Mrs. Henderson and the internet. Thomas discovered that caring for a baby was more exhausting than any ranch work he had ever done, but it was also more rewarding than anything he had experienced since Sarah's death. Emma was a good baby, relatively speaking. She slept for a few hours at a time, ate well, and had already begun to smile when Thomas talked to her. He found himself looking forward to her 2 a.m. feedings, when the house was quiet, and it was just the two of them in the rocking chair Sarah had bought years ago in hopeful anticipation of children who never came. On the 7th day, Thomas made the call he had been dreading. Sheriff Martinez was a good man who had grown up in the area, and Thomas trusted him to handle the situation with discretion and compassion. "I need to report a found child," Thomas said when the sheriff answered the phone. "A baby girl, approximately 3 months old. I found her abandoned in one of the old mining cabins during the storm last week." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Thomas, are you telling me you've had a baby in your house for a week without reporting it?" "I wanted to make sure she was healthy and safe," Thomas replied. "She's been through enough trauma. I didn't want to traumatize her further by putting her in the system immediately." Sheriff Martinez sighed. "I understand your instincts, Thomas, but this is a serious matter. I'll need to come out there and assess the situation. Social services will need to be involved." "I want to adopt her," Thomas said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know it's complicated, and I know I'm not the ideal candidate, but I can provide for her. I can give her a good home." "Thomas," the sheriff began, his voice gentle but firm, "adoption is a complex process. You're a single man with financial difficulties. The courts will want to explore all other options first." "What other options?" Thomas asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "Foster care while they search for relatives. If no family is found, she'll be placed with a younger family, probably in a city where she'll have access to better schools and opportunities." The thought of losing Emma sent a spike of panic through Thomas's chest. In just 1 week, she had become the center of his world, the reason he got up in the morning, and the source of hope he hadn't felt in years. "Please," he said quietly, "just come out and meet her. See how she's doing. Then we can talk about what's best for her future." Sheriff Martinez arrived 2 hours later, accompanied by a social worker named Janet Walsh. Thomas had cleaned the house from top to bottom and made sure Emma was clean, fed, and happy. He had also called Mrs. Henderson, who arrived with a casserole and moral support. Janet Walsh was younger than Thomas had expected, probably in her early 30s, with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that somehow managed to be both thorough and compassionate. She examined Emma carefully, checking for signs of neglect or abuse, and interviewed Thomas about how he had found her and what he had done to care for her. "She's clearly been well cared for," Janet said after completing her assessment. "Her weight is good, she's alert and responsive, and she's obviously bonded with you. But Mr. McKenna, I have to be honest, your situation is challenging from a legal standpoint." "I know I'm not perfect," Thomas said, holding Emma close. "I'm older than most parents, and I'm not wealthy, but I love her already. I know that might sound crazy after just a week, but she's brought something back to life in me that I thought was dead forever." Janet looked around the house, taking the photographs of Thomas and Sarah, the evidence of a life built on hard work and dedication. "Tell me about your plans," she said. "How would you support her? What about childcare while you work the ranch?" Thomas had thought about this constantly over the past week. "Mrs. Henderson has offered to help with childcare. I'm also considering leasing part of the ranch to a younger family. They could help with the operations while I focus more on Emma. I've got some savings, and I can sell cattle as needed. And if she gets sick, if she needs special care or education, then I'll figure out," Thomas said simply. "That's what parents do, isn't it? They figure it out." Sheriff Martinez spoke up for the first time since the interview began. "Janet, I've known Thomas for 20 years. He's a good man who's been through hell losing his wife. If he says he'll take care of this child, he'll take care of her." Janet was quiet for a long moment, studying Thomas's face and watching the way Emma responded to his touch. Finally, she spoke. "I can't make any promises, Mr. McKenna. There are procedures that have to be followed, investigations that have to be completed. But I'm willing to recommend that Emma remain in your care temporarily while we work through the legal process. That could take months, maybe even a year." Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed immediately by a surge of determination. "Whatever it takes," he said. "I'm not giving up on her." 6 months later, Thomas stood in the courtroom wearing his best suit, his hands trembling slightly as he waited for Judge Patricia Thornton to make her decision. Emma, now 9 months old and crawling with the determination of a tiny explorer, was in the care of Mrs. Henderson in the hallway outside. The legal process had been more complex than anyone had anticipated. Despite extensive searches, no relatives had been found for Emma. Her mother had never been identified, and there were no records of her birth in any nearby hospitals. She had simply appeared in Thomas's life like a gift from the storm, and now the state of Wyoming had to decide whether he could keep her. The opposition had been fierce. The Department of Family Services had initially opposed the adoption, arguing that Emma would be better served by a younger, two-parent family with more resources. They had found such a family, the Johnsons, a couple in their early 30s from Cheyenne who had been on the adoption waiting list for 3 years. But Thomas had fought back with everything he had. He had hired a lawyer with money he couldn't afford to spend, and he had gathered character witnesses who spoke to his integrity and his capacity for love. Mrs. Henderson had testified about his dedication to Emma's care. Sheriff Martinez had spoken about his character and his standing in the community. Most importantly, Dr. Sarah Chun, the child psychologist who had evaluated Emma, had testified that removing her from Thomas's care would be detrimental to her emotional development. "This child has formed a secure attachment with Mr. McKenna," she had said. "She recognizes him as her primary caregiver and responds to him in ways that indicate a healthy, loving bond. Disrupting this relationship at this stage could cause lasting psychological harm." The proceedings had taken 3 days, and Thomas had barely slept during any of them. He had replayed every moment of the past 6 months, wondering if he had done enough, if he had proven himself worthy of the trust Emma had placed in him. The ranch was doing better than it had in years. The young family he had brought in to help, Jake and Maria Santos, with their 2 young children, had brought new energy and ideas to the operation. They had diversified into organic beef and had even started a small farmers market operation that was proving profitable. More importantly, Thomas had found a balance between his work and his role as Emma's father. He had learned to change diapers with hands that were more accustomed to handling tools and livestock. He had mastered the art of preparing formula and had even figured out how to braid hair, anticipating the day when Emma would be old enough to care about such things. Judge Thornton, a stern woman in her 60s who had presided over family court for over 20 years, looked up from her papers and studied Thomas's face. "Mr. McKenna," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decision that would change 2 lives forever. "This case has been challenging because it requires us to balance the letter of the law with the spirit of what's best for a child." Thomas held his breath, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone in the courtroom could hear it. "The court has reviewed all the evidence and testimony," Judge Thornton continued. "We have considered the financial resources, the age factors, and the potential advantages of placement with a younger family. But we have also considered the most important factor of all, the best interest of the child." She paused, and Thomas felt time slow to a crawl. "Emma Rose has thrived in your care, Mr. McKenna. She has formed a secure attachment with you, and all evidence indicates that you have provided her with a loving, stable home. The court finds that disrupting this relationship would not serve her best interests." Thomas felt his knees weaken, but he forced himself to remain standing. "Therefore, the court grants your petition for adoption. Emma Rose will legally become your daughter, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, but instead of pain, he felt only overwhelming joy and relief. He had won. Emma was his daughter, officially and forever. As he walked out of the courtroom, Emma ran to him on unsteady legs, her face lighting up with a smile that had become the brightest part of his days. He swept her up in his arms, holding her close as tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. "We did it, little one," he whispered into her hair. "We're a family now." Mrs. Henderson was crying too, and even Sheriff Martinez had to clear his throat and look away. It had been a long road, but they had all arrived at the destination together. As they drove home to the ranch, Emma babbling happily in her car seat, Thomas thought about the storm that had brought them together. It had been the worst night of weather he had experienced in years, but it had also been the night that saved both their lives. The ranch spread out before them as they crested the hill, the house looking warm and welcoming in the afternoon sun. Jake Santos was working the pasture with his children, teaching them the same lessons about hard work and responsibility that Thomas would soon be teaching Emma. "Look there, Emma," Thomas said, pointing toward the house. "That's home. That's where you're going to grow up, where you're going to learn to ride horses and fix fences and understand what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself." Emma gurgled happily, as if she understood every word. And maybe, Thomas thought, she did. Children had a way of understanding important things, even when adults got lost in the details. That night, as he rocked Emma to sleep in Sarah's old rocking chair, Thomas felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. The house was no longer too big or too quiet. It was exactly the right size for a family of two who had found each other in the midst of a storm. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered to the trees, no longer sounding like a wounded animal, but like a lullaby. The storm had passed, and in its wake, it had left behind something beautiful and enduring, a father and daughter who would face whatever weather came their way, together. As Emma's breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep, Thomas made a silent promise to Sarah, to the woman who had left Emma in that cabin, and to Emma herself. He would be the father she deserved, the man who would teach her that sometimes the most important things in life come to us not when we're looking for them, but when we're simply willing to open our hearts to the possibility of love. The storm had brought them together, but it was love that would keep them together for all the years to come.